Okay, you have already listened to the reading of the poem and the first impressions, and now we're going to work through the DIDLS portion of the assignment. You'll do the same thing when you work with curse against elegies, so I would suggest that you read the poem, note some of your first impressions, and then move to the DIDLS chart, because we'll be collecting the chart as well as looking at your poem to look for those literary terms that you were analyzing and identifying on those first few reads. First with DIDLS, what you look at is diction. So notice we have diction as our first area that we'll examine. You'll have first looking at the monosyllabic or polysyllabic word choices. And I have the poem up over here, and what I notice is that typically Sexton here was using monosyllabic words. Words like see and stone. Touch was repeated often. Kill, die. All of these words, even, the throat and the eye, all of these words I thought were emphasizing that thematic aspect of death. Moving on to the next portion of DIDLS, you're going to look at the language style that the author chose. Were they writing a colloquial or informal? Or was it formal and elevated language or more archaic? Here with The Truth the Dead Know, what we noticed is that it's definitely formal language, and I think this is the case because it emphasizes that melancholy tone and fury at religion and the mortality of her parents and of herself. Words like procession to the grave, using the term cultivate. All of this is a more formal language. Then you're going to move to C, and you're going to look for denotative and the connotative aspects of words. We know denotative means the dictionary definition. When we talk about connotation, we're hoping that you can explain the emotions, the feelings that that word evokes from a reader. When I was looking at this, I was coming up with similar words with those monosyllabic words. Hearse, grave, kill, stone boat. All of these words have connotations of violence, suffering, loss, and conflict. And obviously the conflict was something we had identified before, the internal conflict of our speaker. Moving on to D. What we notice with D is we're looking at abstract or concrete. And she is relying on, I think, primarily concrete images. Concrete images like the sea, the iron gate, the sun, the grave, throat, eye, knuckle bone, stones. Even if you look at hearse and church, all of these concrete images, though, I believe they're being used for the connotation to describe that abstract concept of grief and suffering. When we lose our parents, the overwhelming loss, to put that into, to show that is difficult. And so a concrete image many times can capture that emotion, that connotation, that pain that the speaker feels. Letter E is looking for cacophony or euphonious words, and these might be new terms for you, so I would suggest to look at your poetry terms list. Cacophonous words are words that typically have a harsher sound when stated, and they're closer together, so think in terms of alliteration when you have a repetition of a sound nearby, a beginning sound in alliteration, but cacophony doesn't have to be beginning. It can be in the center of the word as well, but it's going to be a harsh sound. And what I found was cape and cultivate. You can hear that, that harsh C sound here, and the cacophony of that, I think, shows this idea that she's returning to nature. She's returning to the sea to find life, to find truth. And that's a hard conflict. That's a hard battle because she doesn't know if it's going to be there. And I think that's why, she gets kind of that sarcastic moment because she's searching, and what we find at the end is she doesn't necessarily find, at least she doesn't find religion. Euphonious words are words that are going to have more of a soothing sound. White-hearted water and when we touch. Notice that repetition of that soothing W sound. Yes, this is alliteration as well. And I think what's interesting here is that just like touch provides us comfort, so do these words. Yet, sadly, here, Sexton has lost the ability to find comfort because her parents have died and there's the loss of touch. So when she's talking about entering touch entirely, when she goes to the sea, that no one's alone, there's this sense that perhaps she is potentially being reunited with her parents or her spirits of her parents at some point in time. We're going to move down to the next section of DIDLS, and that is the letter I, and we're going to examine images. Two things you're going to want to look at. First, what images are used as figures of speech, and then the effect of that. And then what do you think are being used as symbols, and what are they symbols of? So what I discovered is the stone boat. I felt the stone boat was an oxymoron, which we had mentioned before, and that it showed the permanence of death and the inability to move and live, with that image of the death living without shoes, that they're static in nature. And, they're unlike water, which is where she's located. Images as symbols. The water in general, we see a lot of different terms used to show water. The cape, sea, boats. All of this is a paradox because water is movement and cleansing and purity, yet the dead are static in their stone boats and the inability to move without their shoes. And so therefore you have this conflicted nature of our speaker as well as death, or what death means to her. Moving on to the next letter, we're with details. And details, you're going to look at two devices, the facts that are included and the facts that are omitted, and you need to kind of talk about why those facts are omitted. Letter B really is about a poet's use of ambiguity and what that effect is on the reader. What do we know? We know her parents have died within 3 months of one another. We know that our speaker attended the funeral. We know that she lives near a cape. We're assuming it's the East Coast. Other than that, we don't know too much. What we don't know how her parents died, but frankly it's irrelevant because it is their death which causes the pain and the loss. We don't know who we is, and we don't know who she's addressing with my darling. And this ambiguity creates a disconcerting mood regarding our speaker's mental state. Can we trust our speaker? Is she reliable? We know that she's lost her parents in a short time period, and that emotional loss is devastating for some. Moving on to the last section, well, not quite, sorry, we have two more. We're going to be looking at language. What type of language is being used, and does it differ on the character? What does the language convey about our speaker, and do other characters treat someone differently based upon the language? I think what we see here with language is that we have some formal religious diction, words like walking away from the church, the iron gate. We mentioned before the word blessed. Yet there's also diction associated with nature. So you have religion and nature, and I think both of which are showing a journey, a spiritual journey for our speaker. She's struggling with her faith, and she's attempting to find answers in the internal conflict she's having regarding her parents' death. The religious diction and words associated with death for letter B show typically words associated with death and violence, show the speaker's anger and resentment towards death and her overall frustration with religion. I think we can see that down here with the dead refusing to be blessed. The fact that she says, I am tired of being brave. Our speaker is perhaps emotionally exhausted from this journey that she's on. Moving further down, letter C, do other characters treat someone differently based upon the language? What we notice is that the dead and God aren't really extremely evident. There's some ambiguity regarding, when she says, and when we touch, who is being touched here? But the dead don't treat the speaker any differently, and God is not evident at all in the poem at this point. Our final letter is syntax, and syntax you're going to be looking at the form and structure, the rhyme scheme, the sentence variety, fragments, any run-ons, sentence patterns, sentence beginnings, unusual punctuation or dashes, and then the effect that all of this has. So to start at the beginning, what I noticed right away is that it was an elegy. I am looking at 4 stanzas. I understand that that first stanza introduces the death of her parents, but I really think because this is an elegy, that is acting as a way to introduce the poem as a homage to her parents. The rhyme scheme is a A-B rhyme scheme, which is simple. And again, that if we look at the first stanza, you have words being emphasized such as church and grave, hearse and brave. All of this show the complexity of her grief, yet that simple rhyme scheme again brings into that paradox, that conflict that's occurring. We saw that with the images, with the sea being, compared to an iron gate. Something that's meant to be soothing now becomes something harmful. Something that we thought of as simple is truly complex. Sentence variety, what we typically saw is a mixture between complex and simple sentences. As I had mentioned before, each stanza ended with a simple syntax, and I think what this does is it shows us and it lets the reader move along her spiritual journey with her. It emphasizes her internal conflict, and it talks about her grief and death and the release of the responsibilities of life. Multiple sentences begin with pronouns, and I'll bring up the poem again so that you can see it here. And I think this is partly to do that she's alluding to the fact that we understand who she's talking about, that we're familiar with the setting, with the people, yet we aren't. So this is somewhat unsettling for us as readers. And I think that here, the fact that she's saying, we drive to the Cape, my darling, when she asks us directly, and what of the dead, the rhetorical question. So there's this sense that she is bearing her soul to us as the reader, that we're her confidant, so to speak. Unusual punctuation or dashes. She does create caesuras at the end of the first stanza and the beginning of the second stanza. And I think what you'll see is, I'm sorry about that, is that it reflects the unnatural stop in her life due to her parents' death. So pay attention to that. Again, caesuras, if you're struggling with that term, remember a caesura is going to be a pause in poetry. So go back to your literary terms list, because this is going to be used by both of our poets quite often. And then the final thing that we're going to look at is the effect on the tone. And overall, I felt the sentence structure mirrors the content of her poem. It's inconsistent. It reflects the disruption in her life, her spiritual journey, her inability and her attempt to redefine her life in the absence of her parents. And I think when we get to letter E, you can really start thinking about theme. Sexton is telling us that the dead have a truth that we don't know yet. And some of it is a spiritual and religious truth. And I think that the one area of DIDLS that probably is not as helpful as maybe some of the other poetry analytical devices is it doesn't necessarily make you pull out themes. So remember, in class, this will be something we want to talk about. So if at some point when you're working with a curse against elegies, it might behoove you to write that down at the end. I'm finished with the curse, with The Truth the Dead Know. All my pretty ones will also be up for you to listen and watch and hopefully learn about the DIDLS process. Again, your homework will be to complete a DIDLS chart and annotate the poem A Curse Against Elegies. And be careful and safe over these snow days.